So my talk today draws on a book I'm writing that tries to understand contemporary changes in the political economies of the rich democracies. And specifically, I'm interested in the continued viability of what we have traditionally thought of as the more egalitarian or social variety of capitalism found in Europe. And this is, of course, set in the context of in a context in which this is a model that's undergoing, under a lot of strains these days. All sorts of new challenges, more volatile international markets, demographic changes, ongoing fiscal and financial strains, the global ascendance of neoliberal ideology, to name just a few. So the debates that I'm engaging have been very much influenced by the literature on so-called varieties of capitalism. And in particular, the version of those arguments that has been put forward by my colleagues Peter Ball and David Saskas. And this, of course, is a framework that draws attention to the different kinds of institutional arrangements that one finds in what they call the so-called coordinated market economies, or CMEs, of Europe and Japan, and that have traditionally set them apart from the liberal market economies of the Anglo-Saxon world. Now, I know this is a literature that's broadly familiar probably to most of you, but I just want to take a second to go over some of the key differences that have special relevance for the outcomes that I'm interested in this project. And these include LMEs are characterized by decentralized or uncoordinated bargaining, often also adversarial relations between labor and capital, while CMEs, coordinated market economies, feature coordinated bargaining and often social partnership between highly centralized employer associations and unions. Whereas liberal market economies are characterized by more fluid labor markets and weak employment protections, CMEs feature much stronger employment protections and longer job tenures. And finally, where LMEs feature highly stratified systems of education, organized especially around the production of so-called general, that is to say very portable skills, CMEs feature systems of vocational education and training organized more around the production of firm or industry-specific skills. And these are systems that have also traditionally then provided avenues through which also working-class youth could to get access basically into stable and relatively high-paid employment, especially in manufacturing. Now, from the beginning, the core argument, really at the heart of this body of work, was to challenge the idea that contemporary market pressures were going to drive a convergence on a single best or most efficient model of capitalism. The idea really at the heart of the varieties of capitalism framework was to insist instead that these models represent two different ways to organize capitalism. They do different things well, they operate on completely different logics, but both are durable even in the face of new strains. So this, as you know, has been an enormously influential argument. It's really set the debate for the last, I would say, almost 10 years now. But it's also been a kind of reassuring argument for those of us who might worry otherwise about the breakdown of the institutions characteristic of the coordinated market economies, which are, of course, associated with the more egalitarian variety of capitalism. Okay, so what I want to do in this talk is three things. I want to begin by sketching out the debate as it has unfolded in the literature over about the past decade and situate my work or my argument within the context of those debates. Secondly, I want to propose a new framework for thinking about different trajectories of change across the rich democracies. And third, I want to turn to some empirics and try to illustrate the argument that I'm developing by sketching out some important trends in two of these coordinated market economies, namely Germany and Sweden. And I guess my last prefatory remark is going to be that my goal in all of this is going to be to shake up a little bit the conventional wisdom, which is basically the idea that the best way to preserve egalitarian capitalism is through a vigorous defense of the institutions that we have traditionally associated with coordinated capitalism. Okay? So let me start with the current debates. My work is set within the context of this sort of ongoing debate in the literature between two broad and very different perspectives. On the one hand, we have the classic Varieties of Capitalism perspective, which, as I said, sees these divergent institutional arrangements characteristic of liberal market economies and coordinated market economies as robust and resilient. These authors in this camp are likely to point out that many of the institutions that characterize these coordinated market economies go back very far into the history of these countries. They have deep historical roots. And for the current period, the argument has been that employers have organized their strategies around these institutions now, and in many ways derive important benefits from them. And so they're not going to abandon or dismantle institutions like coordinated wage bargaining or coordinated skill formation, because they now rely on these institutions for their success in the market. Now, clearly, scholars in this camp recognize that there are important changes going on in these political economies, but they tend to insist that these changes don't really undermine the core logic that continues to separate the coordinated from the liberal market economies. And they're certainly going to resist the idea that the contemporary changes, these contemporary pressures that I alluded to at the beginning, are going to suddenly erase these historically evolved differences and drive a convergence on the Anglo-Saxon model. On the other side of the debate, we have what I consider an extremely powerful liberalization theory. Scholars in this camp perceive in contemporary developments a real breakdown in the arrangements that have traditionally distinguished these coordinated market economies in the past. So they're going to code, this includes people like my colleague, Wolfgang Streeck, they're going to code many of the changes that Varieties of Capitalism people see as adaptive. They're going to code them as, in fact, deeply transformative. These scholars tend to subsume many of the developments across these countries and across a number of different realms under the broad heading of liberalization. And they do see coordinated market economies as moving very much in the direction of the Anglo-Saxon model. And the reason is really rooted in a very different, much less benign view of employer interests. For these scholars, capitalists everywhere are just the same, and everywhere what they're always trying to do is extend the reach of the market. The only thing that distinguished these coordinated market economies in the past is that for various historically contingent reasons, society had been able to sort of put up stronger defenses against these urges. Okay, so the lines in this debate are, I think, fairly sharply drawn, but the debate itself has been strangely inconclusive. What we find is that even when scholars from these two different camps are looking at exactly the same institutions, they're often reaching very different conclusions about whether or not these systems are holding together or are they falling apart. Now, one reason for this is, I think, that different authors are often simply focusing on different measures or looking at different aspects of the same institution. So I'll give you just one example among many possible ones, namely industrial relations institutions in Germany, a classic coordinated market economy. So when the economic crisis began, there was a big debate about whether or not globalization would drive a breakdown in centralized bargaining. And so various scholars started collecting data to see if this was in fact happening. And so here we just have a couple of graphs that track change, or actually lack of change, in Germany in terms of two of the most common measures of bargaining coordination. And basically what you see is that in terms of formal bargaining structures, Germany today is just as centralized, just as coordinated as it was in the golden era of the 1960s. Of course, documenting a high degree of stability in formal bargaining structures may or may not tell the whole story. It may not even tell the main story. And so Wolfgang Streeck paints a very different picture of the trajectory of German industrial relations based on trends in collective bargaining coverage. So what he shows, and it's reflected here on this graph, is that even if these contracts are still negotiated centrally, they're covering significantly fewer workers than they used to. So these pictures are just meant to show you that it's kind of easy to see how different measures can lead scholars to rather different conclusions, even if they're looking at exactly the same institution. Now, if the disagreement were purely empirical like that, then I think reconciling these views would be relatively straightforward. In the meantime, though, I've become convinced that these disagreements between these two camps run a good bit deeper, in that scholars on both sides of this debate are often, in a sense, operating on somewhat different analytic planes altogether. So the Varieties of Capitalism literature, I think very usefully, has directed our attention specifically to the issue and the importance of employer coordination as really the core feature that distinguishes the liberal from the coordinated market economies. So following this lead, a good deal of the literature on stability and change has been organized around evaluating how well employers' coordinating capacities are holding up. So this was the point, for example, of a 2009 article by my colleague Peter Hall, together with Daniel Gingrich, where they look at a variety of measures and find that, in fact, yes, employer coordination is holding up pretty well in these CMEs. Now, critics of the Varieties of Capitalism perspective are not impressed with this, and it's not necessarily because they dispute the empirics, but because they're not interested in employer coordination at all, it turns out. What they're interested in is social solidarity or equality. So one reason you have scholars sometimes really just talking right past one another is because while Varieties of Capitalism is fundamentally concerned about the efficiency effects of institutions, that is to say, institutions as mechanisms through which actors, in this case employers, can achieve joint gains through cooperation. Or this is what Straight calls the Williamsonian functions of institutions. Critics are actually looking or interested in something quite different, namely the solidarity-enhancing effects of institutions, or what Straight has called their Durkheimian functions. Now, oddly, and I think sadly, the debate as it has unfolded has really skirted these deeper issues and instead been sort of focused relentlessly on the question of how far liberalization has taken coordinated market economies toward liberal market economies. And when you do that, when you pose the question in this way, you end up doing two things that I think are actually worth avoiding. One is that you end up situating countries on a single continuum, and therefore reducing the question of change to movement along that continuum. And secondly, in consequence, what you also do is you tend to conflate the notions of coordinated capitalism and egalitarian capitalism. And these are two phenomena that did in fact seem to coincide during what we now think of as the golden era of post-war capitalist growth, but which are analytically actually distinct and which don't necessarily go together. So here's a little graph that just tries to situate or kind of clarify visually what I'm getting at here. So let's just start with this standard distinction between LMEs and CMEs, which I actually do think continues to capture something pretty important about differences across the rich political economies. And this is on the x-axis here. But what we always knew about cross-national variation is that there's not just variation between LMEs and CMEs. There's also important variation across coordinated market economies themselves. And one dimension of variation that I put on the y-axis here, and that I've tried to draw attention to in some of my work, especially the work that I've done that compares Germany with Japan, is the difference between what you might think of as more encompassing or more solidaristic varieties of coordination, where these institutional arrangements governing wage formation, training, employment protection cover all, or at least almost all, workers on the one hand, versus more what you might think of as segmentalist or dualist systems, as in Japan, where really these systems only ever covered core workers in large firms. So just to go back to this German industrial relations example that I just gave you, even if employers' coordinating capacities, their ability to coordinate and conclude centralized contracts remains robust, if more and more workers fall outside of these contracts, then in my view, we're moving from a more solidaristic to a more dualistic variety of coordination. Okay, all of this, to me, speaks to the need to really open up the analytic space a little bit more, to disentangle these, the sort of complex, and I would say non-linear, coevolution of egalitarian capitalism and coordinated capitalism. And that brings me to this sort of alternative framework that I'd like to propose. So this is a framework that takes off from joint work that I've done with Peter Hall, in which we argued that the term liberalization, that's really at the core of these debates, is really too encompassing to be useful in assessing the different meaning and significance of very different phenomena or the very different developments that this single term often subsumes. So, you know, there may be a kind of family resemblance between certain aspects of Danish flexicurity policy and some of the reforms that Margaret Thatcher initiated in the 1980s, and both somehow can be, you know, involve liberalization in some broad sense. But to advance the debate, it seems to me that it's necessary to make some finer distinctions. So, simplifying greatly, and I draw on a much broader literature, I want to suggest that we can distinguish at least three distinct ideal-typical trajectories of change. And they're depicted in this picture, and they correspond to what we might think of as liberalization as deregulation. That's the red arrow in the corner here. And I think this is probably associated ideotypically with a lot of the moves that are taking place in many of the liberal market economies. We can talk about liberalization as dualization, and that's the black arrow here in the middle. This, I would say, is often associated with continental Christian democratic political economies, like the German case, but I would say that it also is characteristic of the Japanese case as well. And finally, liberalization through what I'm calling embedded flexibilization, and that's the blue arrow at the top, which is especially associated with the social democratic countries, but where I would say that the Netherlands contains some elements of this as well. Now, all three of these involve liberalization in some broad sense, but distinguishing the three is meant to recognize that liberalization can actually take many forms. It can occur under the auspices of different kinds of social coalitions, and that all of that has big implications for distributive and other outcomes that we might care about. Okay, so let me go through these in a little more detail, or at least give somewhat more fuller definitions. So deregulation, as I'm using it, involves an active political dismantling of coordinating capacities really on both sides of the class divide. And with that, a strong move toward what Philip Rehm, who I think is here today, or might be, would call the individualization of risk. So you can think of moves like the dismantling of systems of compulsory arbitration in Australia or New Zealand, or you can think about the recent attacks on public sector bargaining rights in certain states in the United States, like Wisconsin. Dualization, by contrast, involves the differential introduction of market forces into previously regulated spheres. So here, traditional protections are kept in place for labor market insiders, even as the number of labor market outsiders expands. Unlike deregulation, which proceeds through a sort of direct assault on traditional institutions, and which therefore involves conflict between unions and employers, dualization often actually is fueled by an intensification of cooperation between labor and capital in core firms and industries, but where such cooperation is underwritten by, and in some sense fuels, an increase in flexibility outside the core. Finally, socially embedded flexibilization involves the introduction of new forms of flexibility within the context of continued strong and encompassing frameworks. Here, active labor market policies and flexicurity are the kind of signature policies. In these cases, we observe liberalization in the sense of a departure from the kind of market-suspending institutions that we've long associated with strategic coordination in the varieties of capitalism sense. But what distinguishes these from sheer deregulation is that these moves are embedded in policies to support the most vulnerable in society. So here we're talking about a collectivization rather than an individualization of risk. And by the way, I'll just say that one aspect of this that I don't have time to talk about today, but we can certainly talk about in the Q&A, is that I associate these various moves also with different modes of institutional change. So for example, I associate deregulation with what Strake and I have called in some of our work institutional displacement. Dualization I characterize as often proceeding through what Hacker and Pearson call institutional drift. Embedded flexibilization through what in some of my work I've called institutional conversion. I don't have time to go into that, but we can certainly talk about it later. The point of opening up the analytic space, though, in this way is that it allows us basically to see combinations that are hard to even conceive of if you're working with that unidimensional model of change that I talked about a minute ago, in which the notions of coordination and social solidarity are, by definition, tightly coupled. So, for example, dualization involves declining equality, but in the context of continued significant coordination, though the number of workers, of course, in this coordinated core is shrinking. And the other, embedded flexibilization, involves continued rather high levels of equality, but in the context of policies, especially active labor market policies, that can really only be characterized as liberal in the sense of market conforming, actually radically so, because they're precisely not premised on protecting workers from the market, but in actively adapting their skills to the market. Now, just so this is not completely abstract, what I did here is just situate a couple of countries in this little figure that's based on measures that tap into the concepts around which the literature has, up until now, often been organized. So the x-axis here is basically based on a very simple index composed of some of the usual variables taken off the shelf that Varieties of Capitalism scholars use to capture differences in employers' coordinating capacities. And that matter for the outcomes that I'm interested in. So power of peak employer associations, labor management coordination, and the extent of wage coordination. The x-axis, by contrast, is based on also just a very simple index that captures some of the outcomes associated especially with the literature on labor market dualism. So we're talking about collective bargaining coverage, we're talking about a measure of atypical employment, and we're talking about long-term unemployment. And basically here all I want you to see is that while Germany and Japan remain stable on this varieties of capitalism dimension, that has not at all prevented their moving strongly toward higher levels of dualization. And this comports, of course, very well with what we know about these countries, both of which have seen a sort of a rather dramatic increase in inequality and also poverty, actually, and both of them were singled out in this recent important OECD study for their rather poor performance on those indicators. By contrast, Sweden and Denmark have managed to maintain high, even slightly increasing levels of solidarity by these measures, despite some formal institutional liberalization by the Varieties of Capitalism measure. Okay, this is a very stylized picture. It obviously doesn't say anything about the politics, so it's the politics that I want to turn to now. And I want to talk about this in three passes. I want to talk about the interests, I want to talk about political dynamics, and I want to talk about policies associated with these last two trajectories of change, namely dualization and embedded flexibilization. So let me first address the issue of interests. The Varieties of Capitalism framework is based on the idea that coordinated capitalism is held together by a confluence of interests between labor and capital with respect to certain institutions and practices. In particular, organized employers and unions are seen to be jointly interested in key institutions, including things like centralized rather than decentralized wage bargaining, relatively strong employment protections or long job tenures as opposed to fluid labor markets, education and training systems that promote specific rather than general skills. Now, it may be obvious why unions support these things, but remember the key claim here is that these arrangements are stable because organized employers too support them for different reasons, but they also support these arrangements. And I actually think this is right, and I'm going to provide some evidence later on to support that claim, but the key is that it's really only right for manufacturing. And for the politics today, at the national level, what matters is that employment in manufacturing across all of these countries is down to between 10 and 20%. And the shift in employment out of manufacturing and into services, I think, has really upset the political dynamics, because both firms and workers in the emerging service sectors have interests that are in many ways very different from those in the manufacturing core. So just briefly, on the employer side, service sector firms are much more likely to press for more flexibility in the labor market and more wage differentiation. Clearly they're doing this partly simply to press down costs, but the other interest of the service sector in these things is that labor mobility and wage differentiation also play a different, more prominent, often more positive role in emerging service sectors at the high end in terms of skill acquisition, promoting the ongoing acquisition of skills. Moreover, service sector employers, or service sector generally, thrives much more on general skills. Certainly high-end skills like software engineering involve very portable, high-end general skills, but also at the low end, for example, in retail and hospitality industries, where a high-quality public school system that provides foundational general skills is arguably much better equipped than traditional firm-sponsored apprenticeship training to generate the kind of social and communication skills that are needed in those kinds of industries. On the labor side as well, the shift to services has really brought new interests to the fore, perhaps especially importantly for the politics, those of a growing number of working women. And here it's actually not at all clear that new constituencies are well served by the arrangements that have been so important in the era of manufacturing dominance. For example, research has shown that women are distinctly disadvantaged in countries featuring traditional firm apprenticeship and do a whole lot better in school-based training emphasizing general skills. Moreover, at least as long as social protections remain strong, more fluid labor markets may in fact be more congenial from the perspective of workers whose employment records are much more likely to be interrupted for family reasons. So my point is that interests outside the manufacturing core are really pretty different, and that really shakes up the politics. So turning to the politics, I argue that how all of this plays out is profoundly shaped by the legacy of policy choices going back to the golden era of the 1950s and 60s. We know from a lot of previous work by, among others, Huber and Stevens, that in social democratic countries, the modal response to labor market shortages was to mobilize women, whose entry into the labor market in turn fueled the expansion of services to support female employment. What that has meant is that today a large and well-organized public sector now forms an important second pillar within the union movement, and one that represents a completely different constituency from the traditional male-dominated manufacturing unions. In fact, women constitute a majority in the union movement in most of these social democratic countries. The electoral impact of these changes is also important now, because the mobilization of women and the expansion of the public sector at that time, of course, transformed women into a sort of very solid, reliable core constituency for social democracy and the welfare state. In the Christian democratic countries, by contrast, the response to the labor market shortages of the 50s and 60s was very different. They typically turned to the recruitment of foreign workers, while women stayed at home in very large numbers and continued to support the traditional male breadwinner model as crucial providers of unpaid services. And what that meant is that the public and service sectors remained smaller, also and especially in relation to manufacturing, which in turn allowed manufacturing interests to dominate both producer group politics and public policy. So among other things, the structure of union membership in many of these countries continues really to reflect the employment structures from the 1960s, very heavily concentrated in manufacturing and very weak in services. What all this has meant electorally is that alliance between working women and left political parties that we know to be so important in the social democratic countries never materialized in these countries. Just the opposite, actually, where traditional family structures persisted longer, women remained dependent for their benefits on their husbands, many of whom continued to be employed in manufacturing. And actually, when women did enter the labor market in large numbers in these countries, which was in the 80s and especially 1990s, they were entering a very different labor market characterized by high unemployment, not tight labor markets. And what was drawing them in many cases, was the need to supplement family income as secondary earners in a period of heightened economic insecurity. And as we know, recent work by Torben Iversen and Frances Rosenbluth has shown that where traditional family structures persisted longer, married women are very politically conservative and oppose policies that are likely to raise taxes on their male insiders. So my argument for the present is that in those countries in which politics is dominated by a cross-class coalition rooted in manufacturing, the trend is likely to be toward dualization. For all of the reasons laid out, I think, well and still to the point in the Varieties of Capitalism literature, manufacturing firms and their workers can be expected to jointly defend for themselves traditional institutions and practices, while on the unorganized periphery, more flexible, less regulated patterns of employment emerge. Now, unions may oppose these developments, may or may not. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But even if they do, or even where they do, being weakly present in the service sector, they are very poorly placed to counter these trends. In social democratic countries, by contrast, and this comes out of some work that I've done together with Kathy Jo Martin, where service sector workers and low-skill workers in general are well organized and well incorporated into institutionalized national decision-making venues, producer group politics and electoral politics can pave the way for these more encompassing reform coalitions. But based on a rather different logic, and one that reflects the somewhat different interests of these actors outside the manufacturing core. So to illustrate the political dynamics, I want to turn finally to some of the policies and just sketch out very briefly developments in two countries, Germany and Sweden, across three different institutional arenas that everyone agrees are important to the outcomes of interest here, namely industrial relations, vocational education and training, and labor market policy. And let me just say at the outset, I've been very influenced by work that Sven has been doing on the Swedish case. You're going to see the influence of his ideas. Actually, Sven and I studied for our West European qualifying exams together, and ever since then I've taken my cues from him on many of these issues. But let me start with Germany, where the trend across all of these arenas has really been toward an intensification of cooperation within the industrial core, but in the context of this expanding unregulated periphery, and with that, as I'm arguing, increased inequality through dualization. So starting with industrial relations. Each one of these I'm going to be very quick, and it's like an accordion. We can dive into any one of these institutional realms in the question and answer. I could provide extra slides and so forth, but what I want to do is just touch on the main developments, and we can go into more detail in question and answer. So if it seems a little superficial, it is, but we can go into detail later. Anyway, the story in industrial relations I've already basically outlined. It's a story in which manufacturing firms in particular continue to support industry-wide bargaining against a sort of straight-up liberalization theory. There has been no frontal assault on the institutions of centralized collective bargaining. In fact, you have many signs of intensified cooperation between labor and capital in the interest of preserving what continues to be a highly successful export model, up to and including a very spirited defense shared by unions and organized employers for the principle of collective bargaining autonomy, which is essentially the idea that the state should stay out of the realms that like collective bargaining. And this is something that unions and employers have jointly defended, even in the face of an overall erosion in collective bargaining coverage, especially outside the core, where the traditional institutions, say in the service sector, simply never took root, and where unions are much weaker. Vocational education and training, briefly. The German apprenticeship system is really the crown jewel of the German model. This is widely regarded as a key institutional support for Germany's highly successful export sector. Again, there are absolutely no signs that anybody wants to dismantle or move away from this model. On the contrary, we have tremendous cooperation between labor and capital to defend the traditional system. Unions and employers speak with one voice in arguing against the introduction of a school-based alternative to the traditional firm-based training model, and they have worked together over many years at the national level to implement reforms over the years to adapt this training system to all sorts of new challenges, technological and changes in production. So the quality of German training, already high, has only gotten better. The problem is that all this upgrading has actually increased the cost to firms of training. And so this has helped to produce an overall shortage in apprenticeship training slots, which in turn has translated into a rationing of this very high quality training as firms basically cherry pick the best students, and as many students, especially those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and especially immigrant children, are basically left out. Which is to say that we have in the training system a trend toward dualization to go along with, so to speak, the trend toward dualization in industrial relations that I talked about. Finally, labor market policy. Germany has been correctly praised for the way that manufacturing rebounded after the recent crisis. Unemployment, as you know, in most countries went up in the wake of this financial sort of meltdown, but actually in Germany unemployment declines slightly. Now, a big part of the key to that outcome can be traced back to the so-called short-time work policies. This has become all the rage now. These are policies through which the government provides subsidies to firms to allow them to reduce the working hours of their employees as an alternative to layoffs. Okay, so basically in Germany, the government compensates between 60 and 67% of a worker's lost income, and then what happens is that firms, especially big firms like Daimler-Benz or the chemical industry or whatever, top that up to 80 or 90% of lost income, so that these workers actually experience very little reduction in income despite the reduced working hours. Now, short-time work policies are in principle available to all firms, but the actual use of these programs is completely dominated by manufacturers. So, for example, in the recent crisis, 80% of those who were on these short-time work arrangements were in manufacturing, despite the fact that employment in the industry in Germany is only around 20%. And the reason is, again, completely consistent with the varieties of capitalism logic. Manufacturing firms absolutely want to hold on to their skilled workers in a downturn, and they are more than happy to take government support to do so. Firms outside manufacturing, though, and particularly those with low-skill workers, are not at all interested in these policies. They use downturns as an opportunity to shed labor because they're not going to have trouble hiring new workers if and when the upswing happens. Now, Germans love this program. And to be honest, after the recent crisis, foreigners have grabbed, Italy has such a program too. Foreigners have also, especially in the United States, this has become extremely popular. Paul Krugman wrote an article that was, really advocated this kind of program and said this is really the key, this is really an important thing. And I certainly don't want to dispute the importance of these short-time work policies for having helped German manufacturing rebound. All I want to do is point out that these policies are not even remotely redistributive. They redound exactly to the same labor market insiders that anyway already enjoy the strongest job protections and the most generous benefits. So the bottom line across all of these institutional realms is that we have a very successful defense in Germany of traditional institutions and policies that have long served the industrial core very well, and continue to do so, but this in a way has been a recipe for institutional erosion and rising inequality through labor market dualization. The pattern in Sweden is very different, and this is where I take such inspiration from Sven's work, because this is a case where we observe trends that are truly perplexing against the backdrop of the classic varieties of capitalism argument. Because basically here we have very strong liberalizing moves across all three of these arenas, but implemented in ways that protect the interests of the most vulnerable workers. So in industrial relations, clearly the big move and the thing that everybody talks about is the breakdown of peak level bargaining and the move to industry level bargaining in the 1980s. But what most people don't talk about is a second really important wave of decentralization in the 1990s, which basically brought things to firm level wage formation. So in Sweden today, only 16% of workers have their wages set at the industry level. For all the rest, industry bargains only lay down parameters for local bargaining, which is where the wages of individual workers are getting set. The exact formula, I could talk more about this, the exact formula for how that's done varies across the economy. Sometimes the industrial bargain sets out a wage kitty, as they put it, that then gets distributed across individual workers by the local bargaining partners. In other cases, the industry bargain doesn't even set out any number at all, any wage increase at all. It simply lays out principles that unions and firms are meant to follow when they distribute gains. This is much more decentralized than in Germany, okay? What it is not, however, is deregulated. What distinguishes this system from, say, the United States is that it's unions, not individual workers, who are doing the negotiating over the terms of wage differentiation across workers. And this is really important, especially at the low end, where obviously, as you know, in the United States, wages at the low end are basically set on a kind of take it or leave it basis for low-skilled workers, whereas in Sweden, local bargaining by unions is often specifically organized around shoring up, or at least not letting the bottom drop out for the low-skilled workers. Education and training. The big trends here in Sweden are, again, very different from Germany. In Germany, you have, as I talked about, a joint defense of a national skill system organized around firm-based training and a continued pretty sharp line between the vocational and the academic tracks. In Sweden, the trend has been toward decentralization, toward an integration of vocational and academic tracks, and toward marketization or privatization, however you want to think about it. Sweden had already moved in the 1960s to a more school-based system of vocational training. And I just want to sort of, as on the side, point out that this was a change that was driven very much by the entry of women into the labor market. Because basically in this period, vocational schools essentially outcompeted traditional apprenticeship in that period. And then since that time, we've had a series of changes over the years that have all served to sort of move toward a more integrated, toward more integration between the vocational and the academic tracks. And one of the more recent of these changes was in 1992, when a year was added to the vocational track at the upper secondary level to bring it more in line with the academic track. And the curriculum was changed so that all students got the same core curriculum, and you can enter college from either of these tracks. Pepper, these are issues that Pepper, the integration of academic and vocational tracks is an issue that Pepper has been working on for many years. The other really noteworthy trend in Swedish education has been the so-called choice revolution, which has involved decentralization and the founding of independent, that is to say private schools, and more choice for parents, both among public and private options. All of these are things that we traditionally associate with liberal market economies like the US, but they've been implemented in a way in Sweden that's very different. Private schools are not able to reject students. They get the same funding as public schools, and private schools, unlike in the United States, are not able to top this up by charging additional fees. So as a result, you have more market, more choice, but within a collective framework that guards against the kind of stratification that you see in liberal market economies. I know these things are controversial, but on the plane here I read a recent study that showed that for-profit schools have their biggest and most positive effect on kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, finally, labor market policies. Sweden obviously famously pioneered the use of active labor market policies as part of the famous Meidner model of the 1950s, and this was a model that was premised precisely on moving workers out of declining industries and adapting them to emerging sectors. But as Sven and others have noted, Sweden really moved away from these principles in the 1970s and 80s, when policies came to be much more organized around trying to shore up declining industries, especially in manufacturing, and I would say that was premised on a cross-class coalition in manufacturing. Whereas current labor market policies, in a way, reflect a return to this older model. They're much more activating, but they're also combined with strong support for placement and training. It's kind of a Swedish version of flexicurity, or a return to the older model. And as an aside, I can simply mention to you that during the recent financial crisis, manufacturing unions and employers went hand in hand to the Swedish state, requesting exactly the kind of short-time work policies that I just described for the German case, and they were left empty-handed. So in Sweden, what we see across all of these realms are some very significant liberalizing moves that are really kind of hard to overlook, but that are also very difficult to square with some of the classic CME type arrangements. But where these market embracing or market countenancing moves have also been embedded in social policies that prevent the country from sort of plunging into inequality. So to sum up very briefly, if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I said that the conventional wisdom is really that the best way to preserve egalitarian capitalism would be through a vigorous defense of the institutions we've traditionally associated with, or that have traditionally anchored coordinated capitalism, and that my goal was to try to shake that up a little bit. So at a minimum, what I hope to have demonstrated in this little sketch and little run through a couple of policy areas in Sweden and Germany is that not every defense of traditional institutions is solidarity promoting. And conversely, not every move toward liberalization is going to compromise social solidarity. And maybe more provocatively, I'll leave you with this little idea, the idea that I want to plant to provoke you, is that we may be moving away from a world in which we can associate high coordination, where high coordination is always very egalitarian, and where liberal necessarily means highly unequal. We may be moving away from that world to a situation in which continued coordination sometimes comes bundled with higher levels of inequality, and where conversely liberalization, or at least certain varieties of liberalization, can indeed be associated with relatively high levels of social solidarity. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.